Barack Obama's election in 2008 was the latest lost opportunity to initiate the radical transformation we needed to bring about democracy, prosperity, and diversity for the 21st century. As a result, Europe is again mired in a dangerous Cold War with very real casualties, and the Greater Middle East is going through chaos and upheaval. Since Metternich's 1815 Vienna Congress, there have been 6 other such potentially transformative moments. All were wasted, and each was followed by crises and conflicts that could have been avoided. These 6 events were preceded by a unique meeting in 1851 between the man who had created the dying European order and another who would shape the one about to be born. 2 men were sipping the excellent local Riesling wine on the shores of the Rhine in Johannisberg's castle. The host, an old aristocrat, reminisced about an age long gone by, the time of Holy Roman emperors and of a Mitteleuropa of kings and princes and bishops, all swept away by the fury of the French Revolution and the military genius of General Bonaparte. Austria's former chancellor, Prince Clemens von Metternich, was the person who, after Napoleon's defeat, had carefully laid out the foundations of the Vienna Concert and the balance of power system that had preserved peace in Europe and thwarted nationalist revolutions for more than 3 decades. At his feet, a young politician, Otto von Bismarck, was dreaming of a very different world, where his native country Prussia would pick up the fallen mantle of French glory and become Europe's leading nation. But in order to do so, it first had to administer the coup de grâce to the world so painstakingly built by his host, by defeating Austria and uniting all German principalities in a strong nation-state led from Berlin. Bismarck realized that wars could now only be fought for national reasons, and that to survive, monarchs could no longer rely on their divine right to rule, but had to draw a new legitimacy from the national destiny of their subjects. As he thanked his host for his hospitality and left, Bismarck set out to replace the old man he was leaving behind as Europe's new dominant politician. On July 13, 1878, Bismarck was just about to meet in his Reich Chancellery the envoys of all Europe's great powers in order to sign the new Treaty of Berlin that was to keep peace and stability on the continent for another generation. The Iron Chancellor was satisfied. He had achieved all his goals set out more than a quarter of a century ago in Johannisberg Castle. He had unified Germany under Prussian leadership and defeated archenemy France. The new German Reich now dominated Europe politically, economically, and militarily. Exactly 40 years later, his Reich would lie prostrate in defeat, its emperor in exile, its provinces engulfed by socialist revolutions, parts of its territory lost to its neighbors or occupied by foreign armies. The Treaty of Berlin, far from satisfying Austria and Russia's ambitions, had left them wanting for more, thus setting the stage for the next great European conflict. The now old German Chancellor had failed to take advantage of the unique opportunity offered by the Berlin Congress and save Europe from itself. He had in effect become the new Metternich. He had helped unleash nationalist forces beyond his control and failed to anticipate and avoid the turmoil and decline of the old continent. The Hague Peace Conference of 1899 was the first conference called in time of peace to avoid a future war, rather than to conclude one just fought. It was initiated by Nicholas II, Tsar of Russia, who was aware that his country could not keep up with Germany's technological and quantitative advances in armaments. The representatives of 26 countries assembled at The Hague and drafted a document designed to create the first ever binding international court of arbitration capable of settling military disputes and international conflicts. But such an attempt was vetoed by Germany and other countries, arguing that the decisions of such an institution could not be enforced against the will of nations who refused to accept its principles. The Hague Peace Conference of 1899 was followed by a second one in 1907, which did not achieve any significant progress. The 1899 conference represented Europe's last real opportunity to avoid a general conflict by establishing a set of international institutions based on the rule of law, humanitarian principles, and voluntary compulsory arbitration, which could have prevented the outbreak of new armed conflicts. James Woodrow Wilson had no doubt his League of Nations proposal would be approved by the US Senate on his return to the United States. After all, he had been received like a hero when he arrived in Europe at the beginning of the Versailles Peace Conference, designed to put an end to the Great War. His 14 points, promising a fair peace and self-determination to all national groups, made him popular not only with his French allies, but also with his German adversaries. He was mistaken. Despite his best efforts, Wilson did not persuade the US Senate to ratify the treaty, and the USA never joined the newly formed League, which proved to be in years to come a toothless tiger. It failed to prevent either the rise of communist and fascist dictatorships around the world, nor their wars of conquest and occupation. After the 1929 Great Depression, democracy as a system of government went to rapid decline on the old continent and seemed to be overtaken by the more efficient, more decisive, more populist dictators of the right and left. The Versailles Peace Conference of 1919 was the greatest failed opportunity since the Vienna Congress of 1815 to create viable, effective, and legitimate supranational institutions of governance capable of preventing new wars. Harry Truman was a realist. He had fought as a captain in France during the First World War and now had led the fight for the survival of human rights and democracy against Nazi Germany. He feared he would have to do so again, only this time against the mass divisions of the Soviet Union. He could not put too much faith in the Charter of the United Nations he was about to sign in San Francisco on this 26th of June 1945. It was true that unlike Wilson's League of Nations, the new UN had a Security Council that could take action against those who violated its fundamental principles. But the price he had to pay for ensuring the ratification of the Charter was giving to each of its 5 permanent members a veto over the Council's decisions. This, he was persuaded, would inevitably lead to inaction and paralysis. Truman helped to create a political, economic, and military institutions that would shape the entire post-war global order. He also confronted the Soviet Union in a hard-fought Cold War that was to last almost 5 decades, during which the hopes of San Francisco remained unfulfilled. 2 months after the signature in Moscow of the peace treaties effectively ending World War II, the leaders of most European and North American countries met in France in 1990 to ratify the Charter of Paris. Saddam Hussein had just invaded Kuwait, and the UN had authorized, for the first time since the Korean War, armed intervention against a member state as a result of its violation of its Charter's principles of non-aggression against another member country. The 2 superpowers and their allies were finally ready to create the institutions of a new world order. The Paris Charter of 1990 could have truly marked not only the end of the Cold War, but the beginning of a new era of peace, prosperity, and participative governance. Instead, it has gone down in history as yet another ambitious meeting of national leaders, full of pomp and circumstance, but devoid of any real vision, strategic planning, concrete achievements. Rather than ending, history returned to hunt us with a vengeance in the quarter century that has passed since then. The failure of the United States to find any weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and its lack of planning for the rebuilding of the country after the initial military stage resulted in civil strife, tens of thousands of victims on both sides, and the destruction of the entire region. It also led to a dramatic loss of credibility for the USA around the world. George W. Bush did not just waste the unique opportunity which presented itself in the wake of 9/11 to create new and legitimate structures of global governance. He actually built significant resistance to unilateral US policies, not only among its adversaries, but also among many of its traditional friends. After the lost decade of the 1990s, when George H.W. Bush did not live up to his New World Order vision, George W. Bush missed another historic chance to pick up his father's mantle and succeed where he had failed. Instead, we lived through another wasted decade, culminating with the outbreak of a global financial crisis of unparalleled proportions and with a rapidly deteriorating international security situation. We simply cannot allow our politicians to waste the next such opportunity for radical change in the critical decade ahead.